Hey there, AP European History students. This is Mr. Moore, and I am back with a review session for students who are trying to prep for their AP History test. These videos are not meant to be entertaining, but they are meant to be an in-depth study, review session to help students get the most out of the content as they review for the AP History test. Every year, at the end of the year, I get students who are very serious, who want to score, a 3, a 4, or a 5, and so they request a review session. And so that's what I'm doing here, is doing a digital review session. At any time, if I'm going too slow or I'm adding too much commentary to the official AP European History Key Concept Study Guide, you're welcome to pause this video and just pull up the sheet, read it on your own. Google search the stuff that you don't know. You can go back and review the notes that I've given in class on these topics, which you can find on my website and go through them. I'm going to be making reference to them, but I'm not going to be going over the entirety of the notes at this time. Really, what I'm doing is using this outline to help me help you to review. And this particular video is going to cover topic 2.3, Protestant Reformation continues. The first thing that some people might note is that the learning objective B, explain how and why religious beliefs and practices changed from 1450 to 1648, is the exact same learning objective that was on topic 2.2. And that's not a mistake. That's still the objective, but we're just branching beyond. We're seeing how it, of course, continues. That's the whole point of this. These ideas and thematic elements that come up in this AP European History class develop over time. And there's always more pieces of the puzzle that need to be put together. And so topic 2.3, Protestant Reformation continues, is going to use the same learning objective from the topic above. And we're going to address that. How and why? Those are two fundamental questions that somebody always has to ask in an AP history class. If you want to have a brilliant mind, you've got to ask that why question. And you don't just ask the question, that's the easy side, that's the easy cop-out, is asking the why question. But digging until you find the answer, that's what separates those who pass an AP test and those who don't. Those who casually want to learn some history, a couple of facts here and there, versus those people who can connect the pieces of the puzzle and then make some of their own assumptions, make their own claims, and use evidence, maybe even evidence that's found beyond what we talked about in class. So this is not meant to be all-encompassing and cover every single piece of the puzzle, but what I'm doing is using this outline, making some commentary on it in order to help you begin your study, begin your review of this AP European History class. So the first bullet point says, Protestant reformers used the printing press to disseminate their ideas, which spurred religious reform and helped it become widely established. So as people started to challenge the Christian church, and by church I mean the Catholic Church, and started to spread their ideas via this printing press, these things are absolutely fundamental. So I think it's important to remember when I'm talking about the Protestant Reformation, I'm talking about when Jesus was on the earth, he called apostles and he had disciples. And it's clear if you read the Bible that he organized his followers. That's what Paul says in the book of Ephesians. He says that he established a church, himself, Jesus, being the chief cornerstone, but he called apostles and prophets and laid down a foundation. And so all followers of Jesus over time have tried to adhere to the teachings that the followers of Jesus left. Remember, there is actually nothing in the Bible that was actually written by Jesus. It's people who wrote their first-hand accounts. In the New Testament, you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those first 4 books in the New Testament are really testimonies of what Jesus did when he healed people, when he taught and preached, his parables, etc. And then after those first 4 books, which are sometimes referred to as the Gospels, The vast majority of the New Testament was written by a guy named Paul, and Paul wrote letters to different parts of the Christian church throughout the Roman Empire and throughout Europe. And so the rest of the New Testament, for the most part, is letters written by Paul and a few of the other disciples like James and John and Peter. But Paul is actually the author of most of the New Testament, where he's describing how Christians should live their lives. Slowly over time, Christianity is going to split between the Roman Catholic in the Western Europe and the Eastern Orthodox. And then the Protestant Reformation is going to be Christians branching off of the Catholic Church. The Reformation does not affect Eastern Orthodoxy. Eastern Orthodoxy is going to divide, but it's going to divide on cultural lines. There's never going to be this break like it does in Roman Catholicism. Eastern Orthodoxy stays pretty cohesive. Like I said, there are cultural differences between, say, Russian Orthodoxy that you'd find up in Russia and say, Ukraine and places in Latvian Orthodox. That's different than Greek Orthodox, although they still see themselves as a brotherhood of Christians. So there's not that huge divide like you're going to get in Western Europe. When I say Protestants, there's no church that's called Protestant church. Protestants are any Christian church that's not Catholic or Orthodox. Some examples are Lutherans, Baptists, Methodists, Pentecostal, born again, Episcopalian or Anglican, Presbyterian, or even what we might sometimes call evangelical or non-denominational Christian sects. Those are just a few of the words. Seventh-day Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses. I mean, you could throw a whole bunch of names into this Protestant Reformation list. It's not meant to be all-inclusive. There's a lot of resources on my notes that will kind of show you how when the Reformation began, even people like John Calvin's teachings broke up into different branches. Or how Anglicanism, that was Henry VIII, started his church, turns into Methodists and Puritans and Quakers and such, or even Lutherans starts to divide. And so if you were to make this diagram accurate, there would be branches off of the branches off of the branches, if you will. And again, you can go, there's all kinds of visual diagrams that you can find that kind of show you how we started off with, Jesus's teachings and Jesus's followers, and then slowly getting a divide within Christianity. It gets so complex that it's almost impossible to follow all of it. That's not what's necessary. But when you see certain things, you do need to be able to make some academic understandings. If I ask a question, or say on the AP test, they ask, what parts of Europe were Protestant, and you're looking in this key and you're like, there's no Protestant word there. You have to understand that Lutherans were Protestants, right? And Calvinists were Protestant. And Anglicans were Protestant. And that's still Christian. Those are all Protestant pieces of the Protestant Christianity puzzle. The Roman Catholic is still Christian, but that's a different version of it, right? And then, of course, you'd get Orthodoxy in the East. And that's completely different than, say, Islamic. The Islamic religion is not Christian at all, okay? But a completely different religion. So I would say on this map, there's two religions. There's Christianity and there's Islam. Okay? And you're like, where's the word Islam? That's when you have to take those pieces of the puzzle and put them together. And again, you're like, where's the Protestant parts of Europe? And you're like, there's no word Protestant. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about as you have to piece the puzzle together. And that's what we're talking about right here. Protestant reformers used the printing press to disseminate their ideas, which spurred religious reform and helped it become widely established. And so, if we ask that question, where would you find Protestantism in Europe? This is a different map, again, showing you the same basic thing. Well, we would find Protestantism a lot in the north, not at all in Spain and Portugal, and not in Italy, the home of the Catholic Church. And you'd find sporadic pieces of Protestantism throughout France, and then England is going to completely convert to Protestantism. Okay, some Protestants, including Calvin and the Anabaptists, refused to recognize subordination of the church to the secular state. So some people, well, a true Christian, here's one way to say it, a true Christian, the only king that they would ever worship is Christ, right? And so that does cause some conflict. So sometimes political authorities have problems with some Christians because they're not adhering to, they would rather follow the rules of God or the commandments of God over the rules of a country or the laws of a country. And so you are going to get some of that confrontation that happens within European societies during this time. And even before this time, let's be honest, people have always, true Christians would never worship the Roman emperor back in Roman times, and that's why a lot of them were thrown into the arenas and fed to hungry lions. Early in Christian history, the Roman Empire persecuted Christians. And that's weird because a few centuries later, like 325-ish in the Council of Nicaea, when the Emperor Constantine embraces Christianity and makes it the official Roman religion. So you see a change that happens right there. So Christianity is sometimes used for political purposes. And sometimes leaders will use people's faith to try to motivate them to do things that they normally wouldn't do. And so Christianity has been used for political purposes both in the past and even in modern times. Here's this next bullet point. It says religious conflicts became a basis for challenging the monarch's control of religious institutions. I guess I would say the number one prime example of challenging religious authority in a country is Henry VIII. He was a devout Catholic and he defended the Catholic Church. But when the Pope denied his request for a divorce from his first wife was Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. They do have a daughter together, and that daughter is going to become known as Bloody Mary in history. And he divorces his first wife, and it's a whole mess. I mean, there's a lot more always to the story. Catherine of Aragon was actually for a short time married to Henry VIII's older brother. But they said it was never consummated, and so thus when his older brother died, really shortly after being married, they still felt like she was a legitimate prospect for a queen, and that's when she married Henry VIII and became his first wife. She had several pregnancies. One of her children survived, Mary, and she's raised Catholic. And when Henry VIII decides to divorce her, he kind of uses that the grounds that she was first married to his older brother as a grounds for an annulment. So it really wasn't a divorce. They like to use the word annulment, but to keep it simple, I say your request for a divorce. An annulment is trying to say it was never legitimate in the first place. Anyways, he's going to establish his own church called the Church of England, referred to as the Anglican Church, and he's going to be the sole leader of that church. And so some people are not going to respect that. They're going to stay loyal to the Catholicism. Even the famous Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, got his head chopped off by Henry VIII, along with some of the Henry VIII's wives get their heads chopped off for going against him. But you can see that he's going to establish religious control over his country, and there's always been this confrontation in European history as to who has more power: the Pope, who's the mouthpiece of God on the earth, or the kings of the different kingdoms in Europe. And if you think about that, that's a great challenging question. Who has more power? The Pope, who can condemn your soul to hell if you break the commandments of God, or the king, who could have your head chopped off if you're not doing what he's saying. The king, who can collect taxes, or the Pope, who can collect tithes and offerings to the church. So there's always this long-running challenge between church and state, which is why in our country, one of the things I brought up in class was to point out that when the founders of our country are framing the Constitution and writing the Bill of Rights, the very first amendment to the Constitution, the very first in the Bill of Rights, guarantees freedom of religion. Then it talks about freedom of the press and freedom of speech and the right to petition government and assemble peaceably. But the first thing it does is grant religious freedom. So that's a huge key critical point. Here are some of the illustrative examples of the period. Reformers using press to disseminate ideas. Martin Luther, the most important Protestant reformer, a Catholic priest who saw corruption in the church and wanted to fix it. He's known for writing the 95 Theses, which are going to be distributed and printed out and sent across. He sends thousands of pamphlets around using the printing press. He's going to go on trial at the Diet of Worms, and he's going to translate the Bible into German for regular people to read. And that kind of brings us to this next bullet point, vernacular Bibles. When we hear the word vernacular, that's the common language of the people. If we were to look at Europe at the end of the medieval ages, these boundary lines that we see on the map today kind of sort of are on linguistical boundaries. That's not always true. Certainly, but that's kind of one of those things that cohesively makes people feel like a part of a modern nation state, having a common language and a common history and background. But across the entirety of Western Europe, Latin was used during medieval times as the language of scholarly information. Back when the Byzantine Empire was still around, again, Constantinople was conquered in 1453, right? That's one of the reasons why this class starts in the 1450s. They used Greek over in this part of Europe. Greek was one of the dominant languages, the lingua franca, whereas Latin was over here. But if you weren't educated and you didn't know Latin, then you didn't have access to scholarly information, even though there wasn't much during medieval times. But the Catholic Church only allowed one version of the Bible. So during medieval times, or the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church only allowed the Bible to be translated in Latin. It was called the Vulgate. It was the official version of the Holy Bible that was used by the Catholic Church. But after the printing press and improved literacy, people wanted it in the common language, right? If you were French, you wanted it in French. If you were English, you wanted it in English, the vernacular. If you were living in the Holy Roman Empire, you probably wanted it in German. There were some people like John Wycliffe, who advocated translation of the Bible into the vernacular, and in 1382 he completed a translation directly from the Vulgate into Middle English. So what John Wycliffe did is take the Latin Bible, the official Catholic Bible, and translated it from Latin into English. There's a problem there because the original Bible was written, the New Testament mostly was written in Greek, and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. So you already have it being translated from Greek in the New Testament and Hebrew in the Old Testament into Latin, and now you're taking it from Latin into English, and Old English at that. So there are some differences in versions of the Bible with translation, and that causes some people to be concerned with what's the original, interpretation, what's the original meaning of passages in the Bible. It all comes back to who translated it and how it was translated. But nonetheless, John Wycliffe just wanted regular people to be able to access the Bible in English. William Tyndale, he was convicted of heresy in 1536 for translating the Bible into English and was executed by strangulation, after which his body was burned at the stake. What was William Tyndale's crime? To translate the Bible into English for regular people to read. And because of that, he was killed. That's interesting. Not quite a century later, you see, it's quite a while later, but not quite a century later, in 1611, The King James Version of the Bible was finished and remains one of the most widely used versions of the Bible in English today. So the King of England in 1611 commissions an official copy of the Bible to be in English. That shows you how we're going from it's almost a crime to put the Bible into a vernacular to where the King of England officially recognizes and requires one to be constructed. And even today, the King James Version is one of the most recognized versions of the Bible. So you can see a huge transition there, and that's the whole point of this, right? The Protestant Reformation continues. Luther was one of the first, of course, to translate the Bible into German. Again, looking to get that to regular people in the language that they could read. This bullet point right here says, religious conflicts caused by groups challenging the monarch's control of religious institutions. The Huguenots are French Protestants of the Calvinist doctrine that played a major role in the French wars of religion. I did an entire discussion on religious confrontation, and the French wars of religion are horrendous. One of the most famous pieces is the Bartholomew Day Massacre and Catherine de' Medici. And this is Catholics killing off Protestants. There, in fact, is a whole series of wars that happened. We talked about maybe as many as 4 million were killed during the French wars of religion. And that's where the Huguenots would have been involved in. The guy who wins the French wars of religion is a dude named Henry of Navarre. That's a part of France. And Henry of Navarre becomes Henry IV. And he's going to convert to Catholicism to try to keep the peace. And he says, Paris is worth a mass, meaning that he was willing to convert over and to try to give Huguenot rights. So he establishes the Edict of Nantes, which grants recognition of Protestants in France, these Huguenots, saying that just because they're not Catholic doesn't mean they're not Christian, right? So acknowledging and saying, here's the weird thing, right? He's finally saying, hey, you don't have to be Catholic to be Christian, which in modern times, like I've said before, I've heard students say, hey, are you a Catholic or are you a Christian? As if Catholics aren't Christian. And that's the problem right here. I mean, if you go back a couple hundred years ago, this dude, Henry IV, was the first guy who was, officially saying, hey, there are other types of Christians than just Catholic, with his Edict of Nantes. And so that's a really powerful thing for the Huguenot. Puritans were English Protestants who regarded the Reformation of the Church of England as incomplete and sought to simplify and regulate forms of worships. Many moved to the American colonies as pilgrims. So when we're talking about American history, when you take a U.S. history class, you talk about pilgrims showing up, right? And most of these pilgrims are Puritans, people from England who are Anglican, right? But they wanted to purify the church of any old Catholic roots. And so they come over, they're very Christian minded, but of the Protestant version. So Puritans, they wanted to purify the Church of England and kind of root out any old Catholic pieces that were still hanging on. So like completely separating from Catholicism, even though everybody knows that Anglicanism looked very much like Catholicism because Henry VIII liked the Catholic Church. He just wanted, his divorce and his political control of the church in his country. So anyways, maybe kind of an irony there. Nobles in Poland, after the impact of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church conducted a counter-Reformation in Poland to regain lost followers. So Poland is going to have some Protestantism, but the Catholic Church is going to try to reinvest, re-get people involved. And Poland is going to be a mess throughout this class. Poland is going to exist sometime, and sometimes it's going to disappear off the map. From the very beginning of this class, there's going to be Poland, and then it's going to be partitioned, and then it's going to come back. And in the end, even somebody like Hitler is going to run over Poland, and so is Stalin by the time we get to World War II. So you can see there was Protestantism, and Catholicism in Poland during that time. And that's where we're going to leave it right here. Again, this is topic 2.3, Protestant Reform continues. And this is Mr. Moore signing off.